the executive director of the California League of Women Voters, Stephanie Dowdy. She sent a communication today to all of the members of the league, and I just thought her words were so eloquent, far better than I could do. So I'd like to just share some of her thoughts. In doing so, I'm also sharing some of the core beliefs of what the League of Women Voters is all about. That day was not a period at the end of a sentence, but a comma, a brief breath leading us to the next stages of saving our democracy. We're all fighting together for fair voting rights and fair electoral districts across California and the country. We're fighting to fix the cracks we saw form in our democracy that day. And every single person in the league is helping to bring about that change. That's what gives me hope. On this day, the 1-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, I honor and celebrate League members across California. Your strength, your tenacity, and the dedication to our democracy and to voters remind me every day that we are stronger together, that things worth having are worth fighting for. There are people, good people everywhere, coming together to do what needs to be done to save our democracy. I personally would like to thank each of you for joining us this evening, and I hope that you too will consider joining in our work with the League. This is important work, and there has never been a more important time, I think, to think about what it really means to work on behalf of democracy. Dr. Maliika Chambers, I'm going to read you a very impressive resume, but I'm going to start by telling you this. She is so much more than all of these amazing experiences that she's had in her life. And you will see that it isn't about all of these titles. I share them with you not because that's what I want you to focus on, but rather to see that the sum of a lot of her life experiences have positioned her well to be able to be an equity and inclusion manager. But as she will tell you, it's not about her, it's about the work. And so Dr. Chambers holds advanced degrees in sociology, curriculum development, systems design, leadership, and organizational development. She's a certified project manager, a credentialed educator, and a professional advisor to the California State Boards of Education, the Western Association of Colleges and Universities, and the U.S. Department of Education. Dr. Chambers also serves as a governing board member for the Junior Achievement of Northern California. It is with great pleasure that I introduce her to you today.
Thank you, everyone, for having me. I just wanted to start by saying thank you for having me. When Rami and I talked about me coming on to have this conversation with you, I immediately am very humbled because the work that we're doing in Benicia is really exciting. It's important, it's significant, but it is also very, very, it's what I like to describe it as legacy work. The steps that we're making today in city government, but also in the community are going to be lasting impressions. And it is a very, very weighty role, something that, I kind of carry around with me each day. I was thinking about those comments when I was preparing, when we've had conversations about what we should talk about. And I always struggle with trying to take the spotlight off of me because it's really not about me. I just happen to be the person that's doing this work at this time, but I don't work alone. My position, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I started my professional life as a high school teacher at 19 in Oakland Unified School District. It was it was probably the only job I was qualified to have at 19. And that says a lot about, pass the CBEST and have a college degree. And that's kind of what you were. But I loved that part of how I entered the world of work because it was so educational for me, not only as a person of color, but also just in terms of being able to connect with people on a level. If you work in education, and I went on to other positions within education in the public sector before moving into the private sector full-time professionally, it is the kind of work that really, it's focused on the heart. There's a certain aptitude that you have to do this kind of human service work, and that's what it is. What we do in city government and in public sector is aptly called civil service. We want it to be civil and we want it to be service. And so when this opportunity came to me, it was actually not something that I sought out. A Benicia resident and employee came across this position and said, you know what, Maliika, you'd be amazing. In fact, I tell this story, and I probably should stop telling it, but I tell this story where they say, listen, I just want you to apply for the role. I don't want you to take it, because I want to be able to show this community what's possible. And so the reason why that person said you shouldn't take it was probably because they felt like I wouldn't. And, I have a professional life outside. And so I went through the process. I honored my commitment. And then it came down to when I was offered the opportunity, they said, well, we really feel like you're the best person. However, if you don't take this position, we might be hard pressed to fill it. And that's important because this work, my role, was not something that the city itself decided that they needed. The community came to council and asked for this position. And so in the idea of civil service, that's exactly what cities are there, and counties and judicial agencies are here to do. That is to respond to the community's needs. And so to me, because my position was created through a city council resolution, which ironically, the council that voted to create this position for Benicia immediately was no longer empowered after that. So this was an important decision by the incoming administration to continue this role and this work. So that was kind of how I came to Benicia. And since I've been there, we've just done some amazing things, again, at the community's request and at the community's support. So the work we do in Benicia, again, if I could just leave you with 2 talking points, it's civil service and it's legacy work. If you could go to the next slide and just show what kind of the day-to-day life is. So before we get to kind of what I do in a day, I want to show you my primary focus areas. This position was created, my role was created in perpetuity originally. It did not have a sunset date. And it's important that we have dates certain around the work that we do because it provides urgency and action. If you think about scheduling an appointment, it'd be like, oh, say you want to schedule a doctor's appointment. You could say, I want to go to the doctor. And you may still want to go until you actually go. You don't really go until you have an appointment. And so what I did was, one of the first things is I wanted to address all of the tasks that this community wanted me to do, but also put it in such a way that we could actually focus. So one of the first things that Benicia has done in support of this work is create a committee on race and equity, which is called CURE. It is a subcommittee of the city council. This body of community residents is brought together to help support the city on becoming a more equitable and inclusive and diverse organization. Now, what does that mean? People think of agencies as, when we talk about equity, we give human qualities to bodies or infrastructures. And so that's kind of not the way businesses work or agencies work. Institutions rely on processes, policy, and practices that make them go. So it is those policies, practices, and processes that inadvertently, or maybe even intentionally, create inequity, create a lack of diversity, create a lack of inclusiveness, or what I might even add to that, a lack of accessibility. And so when you think about issues of diversity, race, and equity, you might just think of race. But when I think of DE&I, I think of economic vitality. I think of, sustainability. I think of all of those things that when we talk about the gaps in equity and accessibility and diversity, they didn't happen overnight. They happened because policies, procedures, and practices continued to happen that created the outcomes that we face today. So part of my role internally within the city is clarifying the intention of our policies and procedures and making sure that on the surface, does the language, does the spirit of the procedure or the policy unintentionally create inequity in our communities? And so considering that we are all part of these systems, that's kind of what we focus on. So we have the committee for race and equity, and we focus on that. That was just seated. There has to be a nomination process in the individual. So I'm really excited that all of the members that applied were selected and approved, and we can get started. Primarily, the work that we will do in this role for the duration of the time is to do an equity assessment. We need to baseline where we are as a city in these issues, and there'll be indicators. There are indicators that determine, just like any other state and federal agency, our ethnic and social and economic demographics are available. And then we will create a report as a result of that assessment. And people ask me all the time, well, how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? Well, no, we partner with organizations. The City of Benicia has partnered with the Local and Regional Alliance on Race and Equity, which is here in California, and the National League of Cities. I call those two organizations out because, from a matter of credibility, I need people to know that this is not, I think Adina said it well, that people are learning and institutions are learning, and there is a repository of people and content around how we do this work, and staff. So we didn't just make this up overnight. There is a prescription around how we go about starting this work, and Benicia is just getting started. We're not, I don't want to give the impression that, Benicia, the city of Benicia is a unicorn. It is an amazing place. There's a lot of passion and engagement, but the work still is the work. So some of the things that we do after we will create that is we will put together a strategic implementation plan. Now, this is important because cities, counties, state and local governments all have to do reporting because they have to account for public funds, that taxpayer dollars, which they spend. And in light of the last few years, this focus on DE&I has made major impacts in our political processes, in our government and legislative processes, and there has been an attention around focusing on impacts. If you think in the history of the US, all of the legislation that was created and passed by individuals to perpetuate inequity, thinking about slavery, thinking about Jim Crow laws, thinking about the Asian American Acts and Exclusion Acts that were passed in this country, Japanese Exclusion Act. All of those were all pieces of legislation that were crafted with the intention of excluding or relegating or restricting access to groups of people or women or any kind of thing. So part of the work within an institution is to be able to evaluate that and see if there are opportunities where inadvertently or without intention, we have created these things. That's one bucket. We have to look at, have we done these things intentionally, and let's explore why. So as part of that strategic implementation plan, it maps out the work that the city has to do to correct within its own purview, the ways and the policies and the practices and procedures that may be creating that impact. On the flip side, we have to ensure that our staff is educated around, and elected officials, which is important because there is no anti-bias training for elected officials that exists currently in the city of Benicia. And bias it gets a bad rap, but it's really how our brain sorts information. It's you may have a bias where you have a preference, or you may have had a bad experience and you just don't go there. Those are all things that are natural neurological functions, but when it interferes with your ability to do your job, then that's a problem. I tell people all the time, it's not illegal to be racist, sexist, homophobic. It is, however, illegal to discriminate on the basis of race or discriminate on the basis of any of those things that we talked about. Discrimination is illegal. And so to that extent, we want to make sure that we are not intentionally or unintentionally doing things that perpetuate those impacts in communities. I'm considered an internal consultant for practice policy and reporting. I work with all of the departments within the city of Benicia: police, fire, community development, economic development, HR, where there are issues that come up related to how we recruit, how we source, how we train. Is this a question that we need to look at? Is this an issue, or is this not an issue, or how do we address that? I work with heads of the departments. I work with the members of the community. I'm a resource for city staff to come in and say, hey, I had this experience, or I have this conversation that I need to have. Would you mind sitting in and helping me process, or help me make sure that, I use the right language to be able to have this conversation where I don't intentionally or unintentionally get the unintended outcome that I want. I meet with elected officials about matters with their constituency, or consultation. Say, hey, should this be a Facebook post or not? And I'm always going to say not, but but it comes up. But I like that is an opportunity that people have that resource within. And then also within the community, I spend a lot of time doing things like this, talking about the work in Benicia, but moreover, talking about how this city is dealing with it, but what other strategies and resources and ways can we work together as a community, the business community, if you will, the nonprofit community, if you will. What are the things that we should be focusing on and looking at? So, high level, that's kind of a day in the life for me at the City of Benicia. Again, a lot of my time is spent meeting and consulting with other departments, or with members of the community. It's not an easy job by any stretch of the imagination, but it is definitely one of the most fulfilling and rewarding I've had in my professional life. I know I'm trying to be mindful of time, but I also wanted to make some space for questions, because one of the reasons why I came to have in addition to being asked, was that so that people can engage with me and ask me questions, and I could have some time to answer them while people are still on and available. So I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
That's perfect. Please use the chat function, and that's a great opportunity. And you may also have questions for Adina, and feel free if you have questions related to the league. We're interested, and we want this to be interactive.
I'm curious, Dr. Chambers, if you could share with us, if there's anything folks who live in the city can do to support your work, whether that means talking to their representatives, or, maybe bringing something like what you do to their cities.
Yeah, I'm happy to share that. So that's actually a really, really good question. A lot of times people don't know how to engage with city officials. So one thing is just the natural way. You could always reach out to any city official and request a meeting and have a conversation. But I do, as we've learned, asking the right questions is always what's most important. And so coming in with just a question, how do I would say that one thing that is critical is awareness and involvement. We have to know what's going on, how to solve it. A lot of times council and mayors get questions all the time about, can you fix this or can you do that? And there is no there. They need to know what should we be focused on. I would definitely suggest that people attend a city council meeting, or at least review the agenda to see what kinds of things are coming up, what kinds of decisions are being made. One best kept secret in city government are the boards and commissions, which oftentimes they have seats that are open, they go vacant. Commissions go on hiatus because there's just a lack of participation. And one of the positive outcomes of the pandemic, as we've seen it, I mean, we're all here today virtually, but a lot of the board meetings and council meetings are virtual now. So that used to be a barrier to entry for a lot of people. Time or parking or being able to be mobile. Now you can participate even passively and become informed so that you know what to ask for. There, in Benicia, there's a lot going on. Benicia is a deep port city, one of two in Northern California that is on the coast, that, shipping, you have rail, you have access, you have refineries. It's just a really, really important city in terms of services and housing development, economic, sustainability for businesses is all available, here in Benicia. And a lot of times people just don't know. They don't know. So getting involved is critical to know what's going on in your city and how to get involved.
Rosalind asked, what community group prompted you, the city to hire you, and what was going on to bring the community to the point where they would ask for your cure commission?
That's a great question. So, and because I didn't know, I was on the outside of the process. I didn't know how the position was created. My position was created by the work of, I believe it's Benicia Black Lives Matter, who partnered with the local government at that time to craft the resolution to ask for not only my role, but a series of other demands out of the social unrest that was happening at that time in 2020, the death of George Floyd, a lot of the political unrest that was going on throughout the nation. It was a great catalyst and flashpoint for cities and people and citizens to get involved. And Resolution 2103, 2020 was the year that it was passed. It was the 103rd resolution that came before the council that year, actually created my position, which then required the city to post and hire my role, which is how I came to be.
Thank you. Another question is, does the city have any specific measurable goals in relation to improving diversity?
That's also a very good question. Part of my job is to help the city with that strategic plan that I talked about, is to develop the goals. So first thing, we need to collect the data on where the gaps are within the city. And we want to make sure that that analysis is done thoughtfully and not symbolically. When you think about data collection, and it's a lot going on, there's data and then there's a narrative. So right now we have a narrative. We need to collect the data and then determine what the narrative will be, and then also create those goals. So right now, I mentioned some of the surface goals around Benicia, just that you can believe by observation. What we need to do is get down deeper and see what is the city's, and then we need to prioritize. Where are we in the city and what will be the most important? And for me, with the time that I'm there, I want to be able to make the most impact. So right now, we do have some, just on the surface, discrepancies within hiring, discrepancies within, how we go about recruiting talent to work in city government. We may have some opportunities with how we, invest and how we support and what initiatives that we fund. And so right now, those are just the surface ones. But once we do our assessment and dig in a little deeper, we'll have some priorities that the Cure Commission will work with the city to help, publicize. And again, those Cure meetings, the commission is a Brown Act committee. They are public. The agenda, the minutes, public comment, all of that goes with it being a formal subcommittee of the Benicia City Council. So.
Thank you. What types of outreach measures do you think are helpful for organizations that wish to become more welcoming to diversity?
I think one of the first things we do is we have to figure out what the community wants. You'd be surprised. I mean, I think people assume a lot of times that, we'll have an event or we'll have some kind of a celebration and people will want to participate. I think we really need to do like what we're doing here in Benicia. We need to take the time to actually assess what does the community need and what does the community want and how do we balance that. Right now, more than ever, we're in unprecedented times where it's really important for us to be intentional and clear about the work that we do. We can make small gestures that have big impact, but organizations shouldn't even presume that their mission and their values that they began with are still resonate in the same ways today. I would say that organizations that are curious about how to engage in this space, because it is a really, really delicate space to be in, you only kind of, you can't get it wrong. And so it's okay to go slow, but revisit internally, look within and say, does this mission still fit? Does our community, who are our constituents today? Are we still focusing on the right things? This is what's going to be the most important to our communities right now, whether they're locally, state, or nationally?
Thank you. Let's see, we have another question here. Can you give an example of a specific objective you are currently pursuing?
Yeah. So in addition to the broader goals for Benicia's, infrastructure around diversity, equity, and inclusion, one thing we have that we're focused on right now is bias-free policing in the city of Benicia. And so what's interesting in Benicia is a city that is between two larger cities. So it's always a pass through. People pass through Benicia going through there. And so it makes for a challenging environment sometimes to create a sense of community of who's who. So I know that the city manager and the current city police chief have talked about how can we get better at making sure that Benicia is a safe and welcoming place. And one of the things that we have been focused on, at least in this one example, is how to make sure that we are making sure that law enforcement in particular, and the reason why I use this example is because it is part of the example that led to, the creation of my role. And that is bias by proxy or race out of place. So there is a perception sometimes that when you have small, tight-knit communities that people don't belong. And so what happens is sometimes people may call the police as a way of, ensuring public safety and say, hey, there's somebody in my neighborhood, or I see somebody that I don't recognize. And so one of the things that the police department has done for dispatch in particular has created kind of a checklist of questions to answer before they dispatch an officer to a location. And that is to avoid, using the police or weaponizing the police against the community in that way. So that's like kind of one small example of an initiative. When we do our analysis and our assessment of where we need to focus, that will give us more clear objectives and priorities with the work of the Cure Commission, because one of the reasons why the Cure Committee is the way that it's constructed, the way that it is of community members, is to avoid the city, prescribing to the community what they need, but rather having a commission bring that into the city to say, hey, these are the things that are important to us, and here's how we think the city should address it. So it's not really, my role as a city employee is to not go out and find these things or solicit. It's actually to help the city get better to address, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Are there other cities in Solano County that already have a similar position or are working on creating one?
Well, they're definitely working on creating one as of now. But no, Benicia is the only city in Solano County to have my role.
Thank you. That's all I see right now. Anything else? No.
I think
No, I
there's
don't.
one more, Janice. The question is, are you focusing on community policing rather than broken windows policing?
And I have to preface that by asking, if you do not reside in your county, should we even be asking a question?
What's that? I'm sorry.
I don't reside in
Oh.
this county, and so I'm not sure if I should be asking a question or not.
But I think it's a really good question.
Yeah,
I
and we
actually
welcome
want
your
a little bit
input.
more clarification.
Okay.
Yeah, tell us the difference between community policing and broken windows policing.
Well, what I've heard is that with community policing, the police officers seem to care about the people in the community. They want to get to know them. They want to be recognized as a part of the community and an ally who helps to keep the community safe and actually serve and protect people in the community. Broken windows policing, on the other hand, is when the police officers, they become more like aggressors. What they do more specifically is focus on small infractions and escalate tension if they see someone littering. I understand that in some communities, if you are drinking on your own patio or out maybe on your porch and the police officers see it, they can come and threaten to arrest you, whereas in most communities that just wouldn't happen. But they harass people essentially in certain communities. And the theory is that if we make sure they don't engage in small infractions, then they will never escalate to bigger crimes. Yeah, it really just amounts to harassment. It makes people resentful, makes people fearful of the police, and just undermines the work that they should be doing in conjunction with the communities.
Makita, I think that's a great question. What I will say about what we're doing in Benicia, in particular, when it comes to community policing, one of the goals that the police chief and I have been focused on over the last year is really been around othering. So when you talk about community policing, there has to be a sense of community. Who's in the community, who's out of the community. And what we see with othering in other spaces is there's an initial interaction where you don't belong here or you're not a part of the community. And it can happen in a community like Benicia, which is really tightly knit and deeply rooted. A lot of people know each other because it's a small city. In that respect, the community can actually other people. They can other the police. I mean, I've seen it happen where they say, well, you must be new because I've been here 40 years and I've never met you. And I know everybody on the police department. I've met everybody. So what I will say is we've been focused on making sure that we don't get to a point of patrolling. What you're talking about is policing a community from the standpoint of patrolling. What Benicia, and it's also a question of resources, which is one of those reasons why when you build a business case for what police should be doing, it's a limited staff, it's limited resources. How do we best want to invest those resources in the community? It's really less around patrol and more about protection and service and response. So what we've been trying to work within the police department in Benicia is being responsive versus reactive. So that example that I told you about dispatch asking questions of callers before we dispatch an officer, that's a matter of us being responsive versus reactive. And that's kind of the guide where we go. But what we want to do is we'll be looking at stop data and we'll look at disposition data this year to see, does the narrative fit the data? What kinds of stops we're doing? And that will be able to better answer your question. The data may show that even though we think that that's what we're doing, in fact, the impact of what we're doing is resulting in this. And that's why this has to be, it can't be something that is just surface and feel good. We actually have to change the way we operate policies, practices, and procedures. Because we might have a policy, like you said, no loitering or no public drinking, but the practice, the way that's implemented is where we go and we act. Our practice is to do this. It has nothing to do with the policy. And what we want to make sure that our policy practices match, they align with the narrative, if that answers your question.
Dr. Chambers, there are a couple comments, not questions, but I'll read them to you if you want to comment on them. The first one says, community policing begins with a commitment to building trust and mutual respect between the police and the communities and community. The second one says, broken window policy states that visible signs of crime, antisocial behavior, and civil disorder create an urban environment that encourages further crime and disorder. I don't know if there's any. And then there's another one. Thank you. Somebody's thanking somebody for writing that. And the next one is, as a public defender, I certainly appreciate the focus on policy and practice.
If I may ask a question, I'm going to put myself on. Okay. Well, I am local in the community, and I'm a business owner in the city of Vallejo. And I worked in Benicia for 5 years as a real estate agent. And one question, and I had to take a phone call, so my apologies, but I was wondering if your job, Dr. Chambers, is it a contracted job, or is it going to be something that's going to be ongoing? Because I have learned that in the city of Benicia, that sometimes they do things that are politically correct. And I don't mind being challenged because that's who I am. And people in my community, they know who I am. So I don't mind, saying certain things, being an African-American woman, because I know I was racially profiled in Benicia and I worked there. Mm-hmm. So what my question is this going to be an ongoing situation with your position, or is it a contracted position just to be politically correct because of all the situations that are going on in society? So that's one question. And then the second one is, where do you see this really progressing? Because this is why I moved my business from Benicia to Vallejo, because of the diversity in the city of Vallejo as opposed to Benicia. So those are two of the questions. So where do you see this going from this point on? And is your job contracted? That's just for a political correct situation.
I
So,
think that's a thank you for your question. I think that's a very, very good question. So to answer the first part, I am a part-time city employee. So I'm not a consultant. I have a part-time contract, just like any other city employee. I'm not permanent. And I think, the difference is. And so I work 25 hours a week. So if you ask me on the scope of, is this ongoing, prior to me coming on, there was no end date. But what that means in city government is that my position would have to continuously be reauthorized by city government and budgeted for funds to pay for my role. So it's both and. I'm a city employee, not an independent consultant, and not under a consulting contract like a professional services agreement. I am hired by the City of Benicia. However, my position is funded. It has to be reauthorized every year. So in the last amendment for my role, where I wanted to create some clarity, and I did put an end date, I requested that end date so that the city could be serious about whether or not they wanted to sustain their commitment to this work on an ongoing basis and not leave me to languish in a role with no, funds, no committee to work with, because there is no staff. This is not a staffed position. It's just me and nobody else. I don't have an assistant or an admin. So it will be up to the community to decide how they want to reinvest their funds over and over again, because I'm paid by taxpayer dollars. So I will say that. I do also think that, to your second part of the question, and having to move your business because of the culture and the climate that you experienced in the city of Benicia, is very telling. So, one of the things that I bring to the city is that impact. I say, here's a business owner that has had a business in here for a number of years, that is part of this community, that actually made a decision to remove her business. And remember, I feel like DE&I work is all about creating, sustaining, and building economic vitality in a region. This is an impact to that. The question will be, are we able to make the incremental change, and how committed is the city to doing that? I have very hard conversations with city staff daily. And part of the reason why I like you, I ask the tough questions, because there's nobody else's job to do this work. Nobody is going to be looking at these things. But as I use this example all the time, if Benicia does not begin to examine these issues carefully and thoughtfully and actually make sustainable change, Benicia will be a city, a whistle stop tour on an Amtrak stop for historic towns of America or historic towns of California. People will not come and bring their businesses here. They won't live here. They won't raise their children here. Families will not be able to grow old in these communities because we haven't created that culture and that climate of sustainability and economic vitality that allows people to do this. So this work is critical. It's imperative to survival. That's why I say anti-racism is capitalism. Anti-equity is economic vitality. We have to change the way we're thinking about these things, because all of these things, inclusiveness, diversity, equity, is all about making sure that people can thrive, not just survive, and that they feel that they belong. So those are great questions. And I have as much hope as everyone else on this call that we're going to be able to do it in Benicia, but time will tell.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers. And there's
thank you so much for your response and your transparency. I appreciate it.
Excuse me. Sorry to interrupt you. Yes, there were several comments thanking you for that. So I'm just letting you know that. And now there's another question. How does the city manager, being a former police chief, maintain a clear and objective perspective when addressing the issues of othering?
That is a really good question. So if you take the city manager out of the title and the man, the guy that is our city manager, Eric Upson, he was formerly in the city of Berkeley, and he is unique. He was in the police department in Berkeley for many years prior to coming to Benicia. So for me, as a person and as a city manager, he's very unique in the sense of his worldview. I won't tell his personal story, but he has a unique background and story that he brings to his work, a perspective on the world. And so I think in this particular instance, his role as city manager is completely different from his role as police chief. I have regular meetings with the Benicia police chief. We meet every other week, bi-weekly, to talk about matters pertaining to the department and staff issues related to policies and procedures. So I will say that in this regard, professionally, they have different roles. There is enough to do in the city of Benicia from a management standpoint that he's not really involved in the day-to-day. And the person that is in that police chief role is very, very open, if for lack of a better word, to understanding this concept of othering. He's even actually allowed me to have that conversation with staff, just as a first step for them to even be able to consider this possibility of othering. And what the example we used is that example I shared, where a citizen othered the police officer by saying, "Where do you live? You're not local. I've never met you before." And using that same counterpoint example with an officer approaching, a situation on a call and saying, do you live here? Do you live around here? So those were two examples that we were able to juxtapose how othering shows up in your day-to-day work, and why, and we work through it, why this is good or bad, or why we need to change. So that's kind of how I work. I use my background as an educator to be able to bring some of these concepts and map them out. I was a university professor for years, and we did this in classrooms and with the next generation of educators. And so there is some skill to being able to have these conversations, but we do it. We do it.